Richard Thornton lived in a massive mansion, one that could easily be seen from miles away due to its grandeur. He was a wealthy man who had worked hard to build his empire, but his success had made him arrogant. He believed that wealth and power gave him the right to treat people however he pleased. His staff, which included housekeepers, cooks, and a maid named Elena, all lived under his watchful eye. None of them were rich or influential, but they were all hard-working individuals who relied on him for their livelihoods. Elena had worked for Richard for a few years. She was quiet, reserved, and kept to herself most of the time. She was in her early 20s, and despite her humble beginnings, she had an inner strength that made her resilient in difficult situations. But to Richard, Elena and the others were just people who served him, nothing more. He didn't care to learn about their lives or appreciate their skills. To him, they were simply part of his mansion, there to keep it clean, cook his meals, and make sure everything was in order. Richard had always enjoyed having power over people. He would often make little remarks to the staff, sometimes teasing them, but usually with the intention of making them feel small. He didn't need to be cruel to them, but he liked seeing them squirm in discomfort. His favorite way of mocking them was through little games or challenges, especially when they couldn't refuse. It gave him a sense of control, something that kept him feeling superior to those around him. One evening, Richard was feeling particularly bored. He had come home after a long day of business meetings, and as he walked through the mansion, he glanced at the grand piano that sat in the living room. It had always been there, but it was rarely used. The house was filled with expensive furniture, fine art, and decorations, but the piano seemed to be an afterthought. It looked pristine, untouched, as if it were meant to impress visitors but never actually played. Richard had no interest in music. To him, it was just noise that distracted him from his own thoughts. But that evening, he thought of a new way to entertain himself. He called for Elena, who was working in another part of the house. When she entered the room, he ordered her to play the piano. Richard didn't care whether she could play or not. He wasn't interested in the music itself. He saw an opportunity to make her look foolish, to show her that someone of her background could never match the level of sophistication and culture that he had. Elena, who had never been asked to play in front of him before, hesitated. She had always kept her talents hidden. Music was something she cherished deeply, but it was something she had learned out of necessity, not to impress others. Richard, however, wasn't going to let her escape this. He made a mocking comment about how it would be amusing to hear her try to play. With a smirk, he sat down on a nearby chair, ready for the entertainment to begin. He expected her to fumble through a few notes, to embarrass herself in front of him. After all, she was a maid. What would she know about music? Elena stood by the piano, feeling a surge of discomfort. She had no choice but to obey. Slowly, she sat down at the piano and placed her fingers on the keys. She was a little nervous, but deep down, she knew she could do this. Music was her escape, and though she hadn't played for an audience in years, it was a skill she had honed as a child. Her fingers gently touched the keys, and a soft melody filled the air. Richard, who had expected clumsy, out-of-tune sounds, was taken by surprise that the music was beautiful, even though it started softly. Elena's playing wasn't perfect, but it was clear that she had a deep understanding of the piano. The delicate sound she produced contrasted sharply with Richard's cynical expectations. He had intended to insult her, but instead, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't anticipated: interest. What began as an opportunity to mock her quickly shifted. Richard found himself listening, more captivated than he would ever admit. His plan to make her look foolish had backfired. Instead of being humiliated, Elena's talent was slowly beginning to reveal itself, but Richard couldn't let go of his pride that easily. He pushed the thought aside, still telling himself that Elena couldn't possibly be a skilled musician. It was just a fluke, or so he thought. Still, as Elena continued playing, he couldn't help but wonder, who was this girl? And why had he never noticed the depth of her abilities before? This was the beginning of a moment that would change everything. What started as an act of arrogance would soon become the turning point in Richard's understanding of Elena, and perhaps even of himself. Richard leaned back in the plush chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest as he waited for Elena to begin. His mind raced with anticipation, already savoring the moment he would mock her. He'd seen it before. The awkwardness, the clumsy notes, the uncomfortable silence that followed. The thought of humiliating her in front of him gave him a small sense of pleasure. After all, he was the wealthy, successful man, and she was just a maid, a young girl from a humble background, likely unworthy of any real skill. She had no business playing a grand piano in a mansion like his. Elena, on the other hand, stood silently by the piano, her fingers gently brushing over the cool surface of the keys. She had no idea how this would play out, but the pressure to perform was undeniable. Richard was waiting, clearly expecting a disaster. In a way, she had no choice but to comply. She could have refused, but she knew the consequences of doing so. She didn't have the luxury of defying her employer. He had the power to make her life miserable, and she wasn't willing to risk that over something so trivial. As she took a deep breath, Elena felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Playing the piano was a personal escape for her, a way to express emotions she couldn't put into words. She'd learned to play at a young age, her family unable to afford music lessons. Instead, she taught herself from old sheet music and memories of melodies she had heard growing up. Music was something she had kept to herself, a secret joy she didn't share with others. Now forced to perform in front of Richard, the thought of exposing her hidden talent felt uncomfortable, even vulnerable. With a quiet exhale, Elena sat down on the bench. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a moment before she let them fall, gently striking the first note. The sound was soft but clear, echoing through the quiet room. She chose a simple, familiar piece, something she had played countless times in the privacy of her own thoughts, when she was alone and safe. It was a soothing, gentle melody that flowed easily, almost as though it was part of her. But as the music filled the room, she couldn't ignore the feeling of Richard's eyes on her, waiting for her to mess up, to fail. Richard, who had been watching with the smirk of someone ready to savor a good joke, suddenly froze. The first few notes were delicate, calm, and smooth. The music didn't sound like what he had expected at all. It was soft, almost ethereal, like a whisper in the night. For a moment, he felt the room shift. His smugness faltered. He had anticipated an uncomfortable, awkward display, yet what he was hearing was something entirely different. Elena's fingers moved gracefully across the keys, and each note seemed to fill the air with a quiet kind of power. She wasn't playing with the clumsy uncertainty Richard had imagined. The melody was beautiful, subtle, but hauntingly perfect. The sound of the piano filled the room, and for the first time that evening, Richard found himself listening rather than waiting for her to fail. There was no forced rhythm, no stumbles. It was almost as if the music itself had taken over, flowing effortlessly from Elena's fingers. Richard couldn't believe it. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyebrows furrowing as he tried to process what was happening. He had never once imagined that this young maid, who he saw as nothing more than a servant, could have any real talent. She was no different from the others, just another person to boss around, someone to fulfill his orders. Yet here she was, playing as though she had spent her life in concert halls, rather than in the kitchens and hallways of his mansion. The more Elena played, the more Richard's surprise deepened. He had expected the usual awkward, forced performance, but instead, he was hearing something beautiful, something that stirred something inside him, a strange feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The notes seemed to speak to him in a language he didn't quite understand. They weren't just sounds, they were emotions, memories, stories that pulled at his heartstrings in a way he had never imagined. Richard felt his smirk fade, replaced by a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Elena, still unaware of his changing reaction, continued to play. The melody she was playing was full of emotion, a story told through the graceful touch of the keys. It was as if the music was a part of her, a reflection of something deeper within her that he had never seen before. He didn't want to admit it, but he found himself drawn into the performance, captivated by the unexpected depth of her music. This wasn't just a maid playing for him. This was someone with a true gift, someone who had spent years honing a craft he had taken for granted. Richard felt a pang of guilt wash over him as he remembered how he had treated her, how he had assumed she was nothing more than an unimportant servant. It was a strange feeling, one he wasn't used to. In all his years of wealth and success, he had never felt this kind of emotional reaction to anyone or anything, let alone to someone like Elena. As Elena finished the piece, Richard remained silent for a moment, still lost in the music. The room was quiet, save for the last few lingering notes that hung in the air, slowly fading away. He couldn't bring himself to say anything at first. What could he say? How could he mock someone who had just given him a glimpse into something so profound? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw her not as a maid, but as a person. He had underestimated her in every way, assuming she was no more than a servant with no talents beyond cleaning and serving. But now, after hearing her play, he realized how wrong he had been. Elena slowly stood up from the piano, her fingers still lingering on the keys, waiting for Richard's reaction. Richard, however, was speechless. The arrogant smile that had once been so easy for him to wear was gone. Instead, there was a quiet tension in the air as he processed what had just happened. Richard sat still in his chair, his mind racing as Elena finished playing the last note. The sound of the piano lingered in the air, as if it was still echoing in his ears. His initial reaction was confusion. He had been so certain that he could embarrass her, expose her as nothing more than a simple maid with no real skill. Yet, what he had just heard was nothing short of extraordinary. The music had caught him off guard, pulling at something inside him that he didn't fully understand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt thick, almost suffocating. Elena, her hand still resting gently on the keys, was waiting for some kind of acknowledgement from Richard. She could feel his eyes on her, but there was no mocking smile, no sarcastic remark, only a quiet, uncomfortable pause. She had been nervous to play for him, but now she wasn't sure what to feel. Had she done something wrong? Was he angry with her for performing so well? Richard, on the other hand, struggled to process his thoughts. He had expected to feel satisfaction, to have the power to control the situation as he always did. But the beauty of Elena's playing had disrupted that. He had been so used to seeing her as nothing more than a servant that he never considered she might have hidden talents. He had always assumed that his wealth and position meant he understood people better than anyone else. But now he was faced with the reality that there was so much he didn't know. And that realization left him feeling strangely vulnerable. Elena, sensing his hesitation, slowly withdrew her hands from the piano keys. She wasn't sure what to say or do. She had played as best as she could, but Richard's silence was making her uneasy. She stood up from the bench and took a step back, her gaze meeting the floor. The weight of the moment felt heavy, like a pressure in her chest. She had never performed for anyone before, not like this, not in front of someone who had the power to make her life miserable with a single word. Richard cleared his throat, his voice breaking the silence. "That was unexpected," he said, though his words didn't quite match the surprise in his tone. He paused, as if searching for the right words, but there was an unspoken tension in the room. Elena stayed silent, waiting for him to continue, her heart pounding in her chest. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Richard asked, his voice a little softer now, though still laced with curiosity. Elena hesitated before responding. She knew this moment could change everything. The way Richard was looking at her now was different. There was no mockery, no arrogance in his eyes, just genuine curiosity. But how could she explain her past, the years of hardship and sacrifice that had shaped her into who she was today? She had kept those memories hidden, very deep within her, only letting the music speak for her when she needed it the most. I learned when I was young, Elena said, her voice quiet. My family didn't have much, but music was something that kept me going. I didn't have the luxury of lessons or formal training, so I taught myself. I found old sheet music, listened to what I could, and practiced when I had time. She paused, glancing up at him briefly. Music was always something I kept to myself. It was my escape, my way of feeling free. Richard listened intently, his expression shifting from one of surprise to something else, something like understanding, though it was hard to tell. He had never thought to ask about Elena's past, never wondered about the person she had been before she became his maid. To him, she had always just been a part of the house, someone to take care of things quietly in the background. But now he was beginning to see her in a different light. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on her. So you've been playing like this? On your own? He asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. Elena nodded, her hands folding nervously in front of her. Yes, I never had the chance to perform for anyone, not like this. I never thought it was important. Until now. She let out a small, almost embarrassed laugh. I never expected you to ask me to play. I didn't even know you liked music. Richard remained silent for a moment, processing everything she had said. He had no idea how much Elena had kept hidden from him, how much she had kept to herself. All he had seen was a quiet, reserved girl who kept to the corners of his mansion, always obedient, always efficient. But now, he saw a person with depth, someone who had experienced pain and struggle. Someone who had learned to find beauty in a world that hadn't always been kind to her. There was a strange feeling in his chest, something he wasn't used to. It was almost as if a veil had been lifted, and he was seeing Elena for the first time, truly seeing her. She wasn't just a maid. She was a person with her own history, her own dreams, her own talents. And that realization made Richard feel uncomfortable, unsettled. Why didn't you tell me? Richard asked, his voice softening, though there was still a hint of his previous arrogance in his tone. Elena looked at him, unsure how to answer. I never thought it mattered, she said quietly. You never asked. And I didn't think you'd care. Richard's lips tightened slightly as he considered her words. She was right, of course. He had never taken the time to get to know her, to learn anything about her beyond what was required for her to do her job. It was a harsh truth, one that stung more than he wanted to admit. But he couldn't deny it. He had been so caught up in his own world, in his own wealth and power, that he had overlooked the people around him, the ones who actually made his life easier. Elena was just one of many, but now for the first time, he saw her as more than just a part of the machinery of his life. And that realization was both humbling and, in a strange way, unsettling. Richard sat back in his chair, his mind swirling. Elena's words echoed in his head. You never asked. I didn't think you'd care. The blunt honesty of it struck him harder than he expected. He had spent years commanding respect, making decisions that impacted the lives of everyone around him. But for the first time, he questioned whether he had ever truly earned that respect, or if it was just the result of his position. Elena hadn't cared to tell him about her talent, because, in her eyes, he was just another wealthy man who would never see her as anything more than a maid. The realization stung. Elena stood near the piano, her back to Richard now, her shoulders tense. She hadn't expected this moment to unfold like this. She had expected ridicule, or worse, a stern order to continue with her duties as if the music had never happened. Instead, there was silence, a shift in the air that made her heart race. She didn't know what to make of Richard's reaction. His words didn't offer the comfort she had hoped for. And yet there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place, that felt different. Richard cleared his throat, forcing himself to break the silence. You have a gift," he said, his voice quieter now, almost tentative. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her as something other than an employee, something other than someone beneath him. His usual authority was absent, replaced by a genuine curiosity he couldn't ignore. "Why didn't you share it? Why keep it hidden?" Elena turned, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like forever. Her heart fluttered in her chest, unsure whether to be relieved or even more uncomfortable by the change in his tone. The power dynamics had shifted, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. "I didn't think it mattered," she said softly, taking a small step toward him. "I wasn't here to entertain anyone. I didn't want to risk something personal like that, just for someone to dismiss it. You ... You never seemed like someone who would care." Richard's face hardened, as if a sudden wave of guilt crashed over him. Her words hit him harder than the music ever could. He had never thought to ask about her life, her dreams, or her interests. To him, she had always been a shadow in the background, something to command, something to serve. But the truth was, he had never even tried to understand her, never given her the chance to speak up or show him who she really was. For the first time in his life, Richard felt small. It wasn't the feeling of being humiliated, he was used to that. This was different. It was the realization that he had lived his life with blinders on, seeing people only in relation to his own needs and desires. He had never taken the time to look deeper, to see what lay beyond the surface. "What would you have wanted me to do?" Richard asked, his voice suddenly quieter, more introspective. "If I had asked, if I had cared ... would it have made a difference?" Elena paused. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She had never thought about it that way. It wasn't as simple as just sharing her talent. The truth was, she had built walls around herself over the years, walls made of pride, of fear, of a quiet sense of defeat. She had been afraid of people like Richard, people who held all the power, people who might use her vulnerabilities against her. It wasn't just that he hadn't asked. It was that she hadn't believed anyone would want to know her. "I don't know," Elena said finally, her voice a little softer. "Maybe if you had cared, maybe if you had noticed, it might have been different. But I never thought you would. You've always been busy with your own life, your own world." Richard stood up slowly, his mind a whirl of emotions. His arrogance, which had once been so familiar, felt like a distant memory now, something he couldn't quite cling to anymore. The realization that Elena, the woman he had seen as nothing more than an employee, had kept a part of herself hidden, something as beautiful as music, felt like a slap in the face. "I've been a fool," he muttered under his breath, as if the weight of his own actions had finally caught up with him. He turned toward the window, looking out at the sprawling estate below, but his gaze seemed unfocused, lost in thought. He didn't know what to do with the sudden awareness that had flooded him, but he knew one thing for sure. He had underestimated Elena in every possible way. For the first time, he saw her not as a maid but as a person, a talented, complex individual with a world of her own, something he had been too blind to appreciate. Elena, watching him from across the room, felt a strange mixture of relief and caution. She wasn't sure where this newfound attention would lead, but it wasn't the uncomfortable feeling she had expected. There was a shift happening, and she couldn't quite grasp its meaning. Was Richard truly seeing her for the first time, or was this just another moment of fleeting curiosity? "I didn't ask you to play because I wanted something from you," Richard continued, his voice now steady, though still softer than before. "I never thought about it that way. But I was wrong. I've always been so focused on myself ... I never realized how much I've missed by not looking at the people around me." Elena remained silent, unsure of how to respond. The room felt both tense and strangely hopeful, as though something unspoken was hanging between them, waiting for the right moment to surface. Richard turned back toward her, meeting her gaze. "I'd like to hear you play again, if you're willing," he said, his voice much quieter now, laced with sincerity. "Not because I'm asking you to entertain me, but because I want to listen. I want to understand." For a moment, Elena stood there, her mind racing. She had never expected this. She had spent so much time hiding herself, thinking that no one could ever really understand her or care about what lay beneath the surface. But in this strange moment, with Richard standing before her, no longer the man who demanded everything, but someone who seemed to genuinely want to learn, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Slowly, Elena nodded. She walked back to the piano, her hands hovering over the keys, unsure of what would happen next. Richard stood by, watching her, a new kind of respect in his eyes. And as her fingers brushed the keys once more, the music began to fill the air again, this time. Not to prove a point or to hide, but simply to be heard. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the piano strings as Elena's fingers delicately pressed the keys. Richard stood in the background, still processing what had just happened. His mind was overwhelmed with a sense of unease, but also something new, something he couldn't quite place. For the first time, he wasn't sure of himself. The confident, powerful businessman that everyone knew had suddenly become unsure. He had always prided himself on being able to control any situation, to make people do his bidding with a snap of his fingers. But here, now, in front of Elena, he was powerless. Elena, on the other hand, felt a mix of emotions. She was surprised by Richard's unexpected request to hear her play again, but she couldn't ignore the way his gaze had softened. There was something different in the air. It was as if the very foundation of their relationship had shifted, and she wasn't sure how to navigate it. For years, she had seen herself through the lens of her role in the house, just a maid, a servant, a worker with no life outside the chores she performed. But now, as she sat at the piano, her fingers dancing over the keys, she was reminded of who she truly was. Beyond the labels others had placed on her, the music she played wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, more personal. It was a piece she had always kept to herself, a composition that had carried her through moments of sadness, joy, and uncertainty. It was a song that spoke of lost dreams and hidden hopes. As her fingers moved over the piano, she felt the familiar rush of emotion, but this time, it was different. She wasn't playing to escape her reality or to hide from the world. She was playing to be seen. Richard watched, captivated by the music, but also by the woman playing it. He had never known this side of Elena. He had always seen her as quiet and reserved, someone who followed orders without question. But now, he was seeing her as an artist, someone who had created something beautiful out of nothing but her own will. She wasn't just a maid. She was a person with depth, complexity, and talent. As the last notes of the piece drifted into the room, Richard felt a sense of loss. It was as though the music had lifted something inside him, something he didn't know was there. It was strange. He had never felt this kind of connection with anyone before. He had been surrounded by people all his life, but they had always been there to serve him, to make his life easier. He had never bothered to understand them, to see beyond their roles. But Elena was different. She had something he couldn't touch, something he didn't know he wanted until now. For a moment, the room was still. Neither of them spoke. Elena's hands rested gently on the keys, and Richard stood motionless, unsure of what to say or do. The air between them had changed, and it felt charged, almost electric. It was as if the walls they had both built around themselves were starting to crumble. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low but sincere. I didn't realize how much I've missed," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "Not just in you, but in everything. I've spent my life focused on power, on control, and I never stopped to think about what really mattered. I've been so blind." Elena met his eyes, surprised by the rawness in his voice. She had always seen him as a man who held all the answers, someone who was used to getting what he wanted. But now, for the first time, he was vulnerable, unsure, almost human. It was a side of him she hadn't expected to see. "I never thought you'd care," she said softly. "You've always been the one with all the answers. I never thought there was room for someone like me in your world." Richard's expression softened, a flicker of regret crossing his face. "I was wrong. I've always been so focused on myself, on my success. I didn't stop to think about what was right in front of me, what I missed." He took a step closer to her, his voice quieter now. "You've been here all along, and I never saw you. I never really saw you." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure how to respond. The man in front of her, the one who had always seemed so distant, so unreachable, was now standing before her, vulnerable and open in a way she hadn't imagined possible. His words, though simple, felt like a quiet apology, a shift, a reckoning. For the first time, it seemed that Richard Thornton, the wealthy businessman, wasn't just seeing her as a maid. He was seeing her as a person. As the silence hung between them, Elena's fingers gently rested on the piano keys, creating a soft, almost hesitant melody. It wasn't a song she had planned to play, but something inside her wanted to express what she felt, this strange, fragile moment that was unfolding before her. The music was tentative, unsure, as though she was still figuring out how to navigate the new dynamic between them. Richard stood still, watching her, listening. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was simply present, absorbed in the music, in her, and in the realization that he had missed something so essential to his own humanity. In all his years of business and wealth, he had never felt so disconnected from his own life. But now, as he stood there, he understood that the things that truly mattered, the things that brought meaning, were often the ones he had ignored. The sound of Elena's playing seemed to fill the room with a quiet warmth. A warmth that made the space between them feel less like a divide and more like a bridge. Richard didn't speak for a while. He just listened, letting the music wrap around him. When the last note faded into silence, he finally spoke again. "I don't expect anything from you, Elena," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "But I do want to learn. I want to learn about you, about your music, about everything I've missed." Elena looked up at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. This was not the Richard Thornton she had known. This was a different man, a man who was finally starting to see her. And for the first time, Elena felt the weight of her hidden talents lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just a maid in this moment. She was a person with something to offer. And maybe, just maybe, Richard was starting to see that too. As the room fell silent once more, they stood there, two people who had crossed an invisible line, unsure of what the next chapter would bring, but for the first time, open to or if he was simply trying to prove something to himself. But for the first time, he allowed himself to be vulnerable in a way he never had before. His fingers pressed down, awkwardly at first, producing a few disjointed, clumsy notes. It was embarrassing. He had no idea what he was doing. But something inside him refused to stop. He continued pressing random keys, trying to find some rhythm, some flow, just to feel what Elena must have felt when she played so effortlessly. But the music, unlike Elena's graceful notes, felt awkward and jarring under his hands. The sound filled the room, but it lacked the warmth, the emotion that Elena's playing had. Richard stopped, frustrated. He couldn't help but feel humiliated. How could Elena play so beautifully while he, with all his power and privilege, could barely make sense of the piano's keys? Just then, Elena entered the room, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floor. She stopped when she saw him at the piano, his hands resting on the keys, a frown of frustration on his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena studied him, and for the first time, she didn't see the powerful businessman, the man who had always been so in control. She saw someone who was, in this moment, trying to understand something he didn't know how to grasp. "You know," Elena said, breaking the silence with a soft smile, "there's more to playing than just pressing the keys." Richard looked up at her, surprised by her quiet words. "I thought I'd try," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "To understand what it's like, to feel what you must feel when you play. But I don't think I'm doing it right." Elena walked closer, her eyes filled with empathy. "It's not about doing it right," she said gently. "It's about feeling it, about letting the music be part of you. The rest, it comes with time." Richard watched her closely, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to feeling so exposed, so vulnerable. But her presence beside him, calm and understanding, made him feel less self-conscious. It was as if, for once, he didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't have to be the one in control. She sat beside him at the piano, her fingers gently brushing against his. "Here," she said softly, guiding his hand to the keys. "Try again, but this time, don't think about the notes. Let the music come from you." Richard hesitated for a moment, but then, at her suggestion, he closed his eyes, letting the tension go. He allowed his fingers to follow her lead, slowly pressing down the keys. It was tentative at first, but soon, he felt a strange rhythm, something gentle, something raw. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It wasn't about skill or technique. It was about connection. Elena smiled softly as she watched him, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She had never imagined that this man, this powerful, untouchable man, could find something so personal, so genuine in the music. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was letting go of his walls. And for the first time, Richard wasn't trying to control everything. He was simply being. The music wasn't flawless. It wasn't the beautiful, complex melodies Elena could create with ease. But it was enough for that moment, enough for them both to feel something that words couldn't express. And for Richard, it was the first step toward understanding a world he had never noticed before, the world of true vulnerability, connection, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. Or if he was simply trying to prove something to himself. But for the first time, he allowed himself to be vulnerable in a way he never had before. His fingers pressed down, awkwardly at first, producing a few disjointed, clumsy notes. It was embarrassing. He had no idea what he was doing. But something inside him refused to stop. He continued pressing random keys, trying to find some rhythm, some flow, just to feel what Elena must have felt when she played so effortlessly. But the music, unlike Elena's graceful notes, felt awkward and jarring under his hands. The sound filled the room, but it lacked the warmth, the emotion that Elena's playing had. Richard stopped, frustrated. He couldn't help but feel humiliated. How could Elena play so beautifully while he, with all his power and privilege, could barely make sense of the piano's keys? Just then, Elena entered the room, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floor. She stopped when she saw him at the piano, his hands resting on the keys, a frown of frustration on his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena studied him, and for the first time, she didn't see the powerful businessman, the man who had always been so in control. She saw someone who was, in this moment, trying to understand something he didn't know how to grasp. "You know," Elena said, breaking the silence with a soft smile, "there's more to playing than just pressing the keys." Richard looked up at her, surprised by her quiet words. "I thought I'd try," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "To understand what it's like, to feel what you must feel when you play. But I don't think I'm doing it right." Elena walked closer, her eyes filled with empathy. "It's not about doing it right," she said gently. It's about feeling it, about letting the music be part of you. The rest, it comes with time. Richard watched her closely, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to feeling so exposed, so vulnerable. But her presence beside him, calm and understanding, made him feel less self-conscious. It was as if, for once, he didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't have to be the one in control. She sat beside him at the piano, her fingers gently brushing against his. "Here," she said softly, guiding his hand to the keys. "Try again, but this time, don't think about the notes. Let the music come from you." Richard hesitated for a moment, but then, at her suggestion, he closed his eyes, letting the tension go. He allowed his fingers to follow her lead, slowly pressing down the keys. It was tentative at first, but soon he felt a strange rhythm, something gentle, something raw. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It wasn't about skill or technique. It was about connection. Elena smiled softly as she watched him, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She had never imagined that this man, this powerful, untouchable man, could find something so personal, so genuine in the music. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was letting go of his walls. And for the first time, Richard wasn't trying to control everything. He was simply being. The music wasn't flawless. It wasn't the beautiful, complex melodies Elena could create with ease. But it was enough for that moment, enough for them both to feel something that words couldn't express. And for Richard, it was the first step toward understanding a world he had never noticed before, the world of true vulnerability, connection, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. The days after that afternoon at the piano felt like they were unfolding in a new, quieter rhythm, one that neither Elena nor Richard could have predicted. It was as if the walls that had once defined their relationship had crumbled away, leaving behind something raw and unspoken. Neither of them fully understood the change, but they both sensed it. The mansion felt different, the air heavier with possibilities neither knew how to navigate. Richard had always been a man who preferred control over his life, over his business, over the people around him. He had never been one to let things slip through his fingers. But since that evening with Elena, he had started to see the world through a different lens. For the first time, he wasn't focused on his empire or his next deal. He was thinking about what it meant to truly see someone, to understand them on a level beyond status or rank. He found himself wondering how many other people in his life he had missed. How many had hidden their talents or dreams because they didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. Elena, for her part, found herself equally changed. The quiet moments she spent alone were no longer filled with the same weight of loneliness that had defined her for so long. She was still a maid, still working in the house she had served in for years, but something inside her had shifted. Richard's genuine curiosity about her, his willingness to listen, to understand, had given her a newfound sense of self-worth. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a person with a voice, a talent, and a history that mattered. It was a realization that had slowly seeped into her, and for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something she had long buried: hope. But despite this newfound understanding between them, the world outside of that shared connection had not changed. The mansion still held the same lavish decor, the same hierarchy of staff, and the same unspoken rules. Elena still had to wake up early, prepare breakfast, clean the halls, and perform her duties, while Richard continued with his business meetings and the affairs that filled his days. But there was a tension in the house now, a delicate balance between their old roles and the new space they had created together, one that was defined not by power, but by something more fragile, respect and understanding. It was one quiet evening when the tipping point came, an unspoken moment that had been building ever since their first real conversation about music, talent, and dreams. Richard, despite the progress he had made in understanding Elena, still found himself hesitant to approach her in any way that felt out of place. His pride, which had once been the foundation of his life, was still deeply ingrained in his actions, even as he tried to let it go. He had tried to show his curiosity, his appreciation. But in the quiet moments of the day, he realized there was something more he needed to do to break the final barrier that stood between them. It happened when he saw her playing the piano once again. Just a few days after their last interaction, he had come into the room, not intending to disturb her, but the moment he saw her fingers glide over the keys with such grace, such ease, he couldn't stop himself from watching. She wasn't playing for him this time, she was playing for herself, lost in the melody as she had done for years. The music was different now, no longer the hesitant notes of someone unsure if they could share their talent with the world. It was confident, free, full of emotion. And Richard realized with startling clarity that this was the moment. This was the moment he had been waiting for. She paused midway through the piece, and when she turned to see him standing there was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. She simply looked at him as if expecting him to say something, to do something. The silence stretched between them, heavy but comfortable. Before Richard finally spoke, "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but sincere. "I've been thinking about how much I've missed, how much I've taken for granted. I've spent my life building walls around myself, thinking that wealth and power meant everything, but I was wrong. I was blind." He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on her. "You showed me a part of the world I never knew existed. A world where talent isn't about status or recognition. It's about feeling." Elena didn't know how to respond at first. Richard's words were not what she had expected. There was no arrogance, no pride in his tone, just a quiet humility that took her by surprise. She had spent so long trying to hide herself, trying to remain unnoticed, that hearing him speak so openly about his own flaws, his own realizations, made something inside her stir. She had never imagined this kind of conversation with him, this raw exchange of vulnerability. Richard continued, his voice more resolute now, as though he had made a decision. "I want to change things. I want to learn from you, Elena. I want to understand what it means to feel the way you feel when you play. I don't want to just watch from the sidelines anymore. I want to be a part of it." Elena's breath caught in her chest. The words, the honesty in his voice, struck a chord deep within her. It was more than she had ever hoped for, more than she ever expected from someone like Richard. She had lived her life under the assumption that her dreams, her music were just small, insignificant parts of her existence, things that no one would care to notice. But here, in this moment, Richard was asking to be part of that world. He was stepping into a space she had guarded for so long, a space where only her music had existed, untouched and untapped. For a moment, the world felt still. Then Elena slowly nodded, the barest hint of a smile curving her lips. "If you're really willing," she said softly, "then I'll show you." In that moment, everything seemed to shift. There was no longer the gulf between them, no longer the divide of power or status. They were simply two people, standing in the room together, each willing to give something of themselves to the other. It wasn't about music or wealth, status or pride. It was about something deeper, something neither of them had fully understood until now. From that night onward, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. It wasn't instant or without its complexities, but with every passing day,